Welcome everyone to the second of our Thinkpiece panels, an interdisciplinary highlight of our inaugural series for the Critical AI Initiative at Rutgers. I'm Lauren Goodlad, Professor of English and Comp Lit here at Rutgers, and it's my honor to welcome you and thank you so sincerely for joining us. It's a thrill to have all of you here. As many of you know, the goal of critical AI is to bring humanistic thinking and critical methods into close collaboration with the work of computer scientists and other technologists in exploring the diverse challenges now circulating around artificial intelligence and machine learning. Our venture takes off from a unique partnership between two Rutgers institutes, the Center for Cultural Analysis, directed by my colleague in English, Colin Jager, and the Center for Cognitive Science, headed by Faculty Director John McGann in Psychology and Executive Director Sarah Pixley. I pause to note briefly how invaluable Sarah's work has been throughout this process, as well as to add a special shout out to our crack SAS technology team and to Jake Romano, our nimble grad student project assistant. Our vision has been to create real interdisciplinary dialogue around research, teaching, and public awareness in the crucial terrain of those complex and rapidly developing technologies now emerging under the rubrics of machine learning and artificial intelligence. This required us to convene a steering committee composed of wide-ranging cross-disciplinary experts, legal, philosophical, historical, anthropological, and artistic, as well as technological. And for today's panel, in which we welcome leading and budding scholars in the areas of decoloniality, algorithmic justice, and critical race, it's my special pleasure to introduce today's introducer, Britt S. Paris. But before I do so, I want to thank Mark Akas, Dean at the School of Communications and Information, for helping to make it possible for us to bring Sophia Noble to this virtual space. Of course, to thank Sophia herself. Sophia and I go back a ways, as well as Dwight Banerjee and Lily Hu for joining us today. And again, to thank all of you for being here with us. We very much look forward to your participation. A quick word to say that the chat function has been disabled for today, as has the hand raise function. So we're asking you to please hold your questions, but jot them down and put them in the Q&A feature of your Zoom interface. You won't see them when you send them until after we recognize the question, at which point you will see it, and this will enable you to see what questions have so far been asked. We'll try to get to all of you, so thank you in advance for your patience. I also wanted to let you know that we are recording these various events, and we will be archiving them. If you would like to see them in advance of that, just email me, Lauren Goodlad at Rutgers. You can find me via any search. And the same goes if you are interested in taking part in the breakout sessions that are going to follow this series. Just email me, let me know of your interest. We'll get back to you. Without further ado, our introducer, Britt S. Paris is an assistant professor at Rutgers University and a critical informatics scholar studying how groups build, use, and understand information systems according to their values, and how these systems influence evidentiary standards and political action. She is currently thinking about new internet infrastructures and current debates over AI-generated information objects. She has published work on internet infrastructure projects, digital labor, and state and grassroots data sets on environmental racism and police brutality, analyzed through the lenses of political economy, feminist social epistemology, and critical race theory. I now turn things over to Professor Paris.
Thanks so much, Lauren. So it's really a pleasure to have all of you here today. And I'm really excited to have you all hear from our wonderful guests who, probably really need no introduction. They're a set of wonderful scholars. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. Super excited to hear from them. So we have Dwight Banerjee. He's an assistant professor of science, technology, and society at MIT. Banerjee's ongoing research pushes science and technology studies into the global South, which is really an important contribution to STS. He develops post-colonial and subaltern orientations in the scholarship on science, medicine, and technology. He has 3 amazing books that have come out or are coming out. The first of which is Enduring Cancer, Life, Death, and Diagnosis in Delhi. The Political Life of Blood in India. And his current research project is a counter history of computing in India. And this tracks the historical and contemporary lives of computing technologies in India. He's won many prestigious awards for his work and his research, and including the film that he produced and directed, I believe, which is awesome in and of itself, called The Beloved Witness, on the Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali, and it was nominated for the Best Short Documentary at the New York Indo-American Film Festival. So we're really excited to have Dwight with us today. Dr. Safiya Noble, probably needs no introduction. She's an associate professor at the University of California in Los Angeles in the Department of Information Studies, where I also am proud to say I got my PhD and was very lucky to learn from her. A lot of my work is very much influenced by hers. So it really is a pleasure to have her with us here today. At UCLA, she serves as co-founder and co-director with Dr. Sarah Roberts of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, or C2I2, which has many prodigious funders. She holds appointments in African American studies and gender studies. She's a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. She is on the board of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative with feminist legal theorists Marianne Franks and Danielle Citrone, who are really luminaries in the field. It's so awesome to have her on that board and doing this important work that serves those vulnerable to online harassment. So she's the author, as most of you probably know, of the best-selling book on racist and sexist algorithmic bias in commercial search engines, titled Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. And this has been widely reviewed and lauded in scholarly and popular publications. So happy to have you with us today, Safiya. And then we have Lily Hugh, who is a budding scholar, an emerging scholar, but whose work is very exciting and engaging. I'm excited for you all to hear from her today. So she's a PhD candidate in applied mathematics and philosophy at Harvard. She works in philosophy of social science and political and social philosophy. Her current project is on causal inference methodology in the social sciences and focuses on how various statistical frameworks treat and measure the causal effect on social categories such as race, and ultimately how such methods are seen to back and support normative claims about racial discrimination and inequities, pretty broadly. Previously, she's worked on topics in machine learning theory and algorithmic fairness. So we're really excited to host you all here today and to hear more about your fabulous work and to discuss this work with you later in the Q&A.
Recently, I've been struck by the aesthetics of AI. For example, projects like Turkish artist Refik Anadol's data sculptures. In this video of an installation titled Melting Memories, we see a person standing in front of these images as if dreaming recursively, dreaming of the possible dreams of an artificial unconscious. As large data streams traverse algorithms, they produce patterns whose meanings are opaque to even the designers. What strikes me as powerful is not the claim that such visualizations reveal deeper truths. Rather, what strikes me is the fact of their ineffability. I think they entrance us because they resist our desire to comprehend. I start with this sculpture as a tangent. What interests me particularly is not the boundary between humans and machines, but to put it more plainly, between humans and those humans that have been historically dehumanized, forcing them to assert, for example, that their lives matter. Sometimes resistance to this dehumanization has come through an embrace of the possibilities of becoming android. I'm thinking here, of course, of Donna Haraway and Janelle Monáe. Dehumanization comes in many forms. The process I want to focus on today, the colonial, will take us into a different space-time. Before leaving, however, let me leave a question hanging with a promise that I will return to it in the end. Do post-colonial androids dream of post-colonial sheep? For now, let's rewind to the first decade of Indian independence and to a very different machine, the country's first natively built computer, the TIFRAC. The TIFRAC was engineered as a tool primarily for physicists. Not accidentally, the first cohort of independent India's scientist leaders were almost all astroparticle physicists. If the colonial state had inhibited the more applied sciences, they had not been able to chain the imaginations of those working in these more speculative fields. Thus, Asia's first Nobel Prize winner in the sciences, C.V. Raman, began and finished his prize-winning paper while for the first time at sea, struck by an epiphany while watching light scatter on water. At the time of independence, three other particle physicists, Homi Bhabha, Eknath Saha, P.C. Mahalanobis, were each poised to become big institution builders, pulled back from their astral dreamings by the magnetic promise of decolonization. The TIFRAC was a product of its moment. The acronym reveals its home, the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research, or TIFR. TIFR was started and led by the young charismatic Homi Bhabha, who had very recently returned from the Cavendish Labs. Till this time, Bhabha had spent his early years preoccupied with cosmic ray research. Cosmic rays are packets of energy that come to us from galaxies further than our own. But the Bhabha that interests me here is the one tasked with harnessing nuclear energy to fuel India's modernization. In the middle of the Cold War, he promised the country safe nuclear power by leading the global scientific effort to roll back nuclear weaponization. One might think of the TIFRAC then as the materialization of post-colonial dream. The leaders of recently decolonized parts of the global south looked to the alluring magic of technology to redress past wrongs. Visionary leaders such as Nehru, Nasser, Nkrumah, and Tito imagined that the magic of technology would allow for an accelerated modernization, making up for the time they had lost during the colonial years. Of course, the continued asymmetries today between the global north and south are a nagging reminder of this imagination's limit. But for a brief post-colonial moment, anything seemed possible. When it was finally commissioned, for instance, the TIFRAC rivaled anything built in the United States. TIFR is located in the heart of Bombay, but also cut off from the city by security checkpoints, guarded by an army rarely seen within the country's borders. Once past these gates, I was confronted with masterpieces of modernist architecture overlooking the sea. Bhabha had been particularly insistent on this. He imagined his scientists walking for long hours along the water's edge, gazing at its expanse. Even today, TIFR seems enfolded in its own time, a time slowed down rather than speeded up, a time for contemplation about fundamental questions. This then is the paradox at the heart of TIFR. Designed to accelerate time in India, within its walls, its time ticked to its own beat, responsive to the rhythms of the imagination rather than that of modernization. Entering the gates, I had been prepared for the spectacular structures, not for what was inside. At the entrance foyer to the main building, I was confronted with a stunning 13-foot mural. Looking closer, I saw that it was painted by M.F. Hussain, the country's most well-known artist. The mural dated to 1962, from a time he was not the household name he is now. Hussein was expected to stay for a year, and the famously quick painter he was, he probably needed about half that time. Instead, fascinated by DIFR, he slowed himself down, spending 2 years with the scientists over meals and tea, painting portraits of their life and work. The pull of DIFR's time, it seems, kept even the famously iterant Hussein in place. Looking around further, it became clear that the mural was no exception. Works by the most well-known Indian names in the contemporary international art world hung unostentatiously over photocopy machines and in bustling canteens. Looking through the archives revealed that almost every one of them was bought at a time so early in the artist's career that the money from their sale would have gone straight into long-delayed rent checks. How did DIFR, a nuclear research facility closed to the public, become the finest and most secret gallery for modern Indian art? To figure out the collection, let's look a little closer at the artists. The single photograph from 1948 captures them. They are Raza, Souza, Gaitonde, Ara, Hussein, and Taib Mehta sitting around a small cafe that Baba and his friends had secured for them as a space to exhibit their work. Souza was a lapsed but tormented Catholic, Raza and Hussein were Muslim, Ara was the Dalit, and Gaitonde and Mehta were Hindus. The main challenge before them was that they refused the genres they had been assigned. The colonial art establishment had decided that the Oriental Indian could not aspire to realism. But of course, this did not quell their missionary zeal to try. So over a century, they set up schools to discipline Indian art into a realist idiom. The internalized wounds of this accusation survived independence. The city's leading art critic was so aghast by their aesthetic experiments that he reviewed their collective exhibition as a collection of monstrosities by daubers who cannot paint a tree to look like a tree. The new Bombay Chief Minister Morarji Desai, who would later become Prime Minister, declared all modern art to be queer. He perhaps did not appreciate the irony that he was standing in front of a Le Corbusier building that he had just inaugurated. These criticisms motivate these artists to become a formal collective defined by their defiance, the Progressive Artists Group. Of course, post-war Europe too struggled over such questions, with Benjamin and Lukács famously fighting for the soul of progressive art. But this was no mirror of the European debates. To begin with, they began painting entirely unaware of such controversy. Ara's father was a chauffeur who died when he was 10. He had already lost his mother when he was 3. Through years of domestic service, a spell in jail for participating in the anti-colonial movement, and a job as a car cleaner, he kept up his urge to paint. Raza had moved to Bombay 4 years ago, sleeping rent-free in the room of a taxi driver who worked mostly during the night. And famously, Souza recollects first meeting Hussein in literal precarity. A painter of billboards, he was standing on a scaffolding, holding a palette in one hand and a large brush in the other, some more brushes in his mouth, and a pot of paint dangled from its handle on one foot, a Muslim Tarzan. As for Souza himself, his father died 3 months after his birth, leaving his young wife heaped with debt. She smuggled the almost dying child into the city and gave him up to the church in an effort to save him. Suffice to say that the priesthood did not stick. He began his career after being expelled from a British-run art school. Already tired of its aesthetic, he was finally thrown out for tearing down a Union Jack that the British principal provocatively raised during a day of anti-colonial protest. But economic circumstances alone do not make aesthetics. In fact, these stories told of Hussein and Souza satisfy a classic modernist myth, that of the artist as the outsider. What set them apart from their European contemporaries, then, was not their penury, but world history. To be modern, you had to first be fully human, a privilege still denied to those recently decolonized. Take, for example, Baudelaire's definitional description of the modernist artist. Away from home and yet to feel at home anywhere, to see the world, to be at the very center of the world, and yet to be unseen by the world. Hussein, dangling from the billboards wearing his Muslim topi in a time of religious riots, did not quite meld into the background. Anonymity, ennui, and boredom, these were not possibilities or even desires for anyone in this collective. They did share something, however, with Baudelaire's painter and Benjamin's flaneur. They too felt the shock of the new. As Hussein would describe years later, we would have intense discussions about our emerging India, about art and modernity, our desires, hopes, and aspirations. Our world then was full of bright colors, our bellies full of fire. But even in this, the shock of the new was not the rise of machines or ongoing industrialization. It was India's baptism by fire as the British left the country cleaved in two, divided along religious lines. To put it plainly, this photograph was taken during the process of partition, which took about 2 million lives. Catalyzed into action, the Hindu nationalists who now dominate Indian politics were just coming into their own. Their assassin had just killed Gandhi, and they had already begun their now trademark acts of burning down mosques. As early as then, right-wing groups attacked their exhibitions and filed charges of obscenity. Famously, when the Hindu rights ascent reached its peak in the early 1990s, Hussain was their first target, leading to his persecution and death in exile. What draws me to this moment then is that while the world was literally burning down around them, these artists could only describe the fire of their own creativity. Throughout their lives, the two Muslims in the groups would be asked about their difference, but then and for decades later, they would say nothing of this. Even while in exile, Hussein responded, for example, that we had different visions, different sensibilities, but what was common was a search for a significant form. The idea of a significant form drew them together, and again, tellingly, it revealed all the brash contradictions of their project. The term was coined by the English art critic Clive Bell, whose closest ally Roger Fry had recently declared that all Indian works of art were utterly distasteful. Raza still takes particular pleasure in quoting Fry's long diatribe. And so these artists battled a decade of ridicule and poverty with a blasé, almost joyful naivete. They would not describe themselves as Indian, for that meant capitulating to nationalist art. But by refusing the safety of this category, they opened themselves up to the charge of being cheap imitations of the West. It took a writer of John Berger's Equity to recognize this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. After he saw Souza's first exhibition, he expressed his genuine confusion about what to call this art. Was it Indian or was it world historical? The only answer he could settle on was that it gave him pleasure. I'm close to the end of my time, so let me come straight to the point. What continues to draw me to this art, and more broadly to TIFR, is the particular kind of claim to modernist universality hidden within an institution meant to civilize. These scientists and artists would not be drawn into the conception of time that accompanied modernization theory, that the poorer nations needed to catch up in historical time with the rest of the world. Instead, they insisted on a historical coevalness now and not in some deferred future. To call this art for art's sake would be to misunderstand the project. This was art produced within conditions not meant for its survival. Which brings me to my original question. It turns out that the post-colonial human did not really dream only of post-colonial sheep, nor did they dream of 100 sheep marching along the straight and narrow time of modernization, putting to sleep the nightmare of colonialism and underdevelopment. They dreamt instead of a higher form of a heterogeneity of spacetimes. In their art, they amplified the call to a reimagined universalism that elsewhere we can trace to the works of Fanon, Said, Sylvia, Winter, to name only a few. But what, if anything, has this to do with AI? AI is the quintessential outcome of the universalizing project. In many of its current forms, humans are essentially a commensurable resource. Even when AI dreams, Google's Deep Dream project, for instance, it does so only as a byproduct of a desire to fully classify and catalog the world. AI projects are driven by the same engine of universalization that fueled the colonial desire to ceaselessly catalog, comprehend, surveil, and tame difference. And like colonialism, this desire is tied to a very particular end. Corporations insist we can police, govern, and distribute resources better once we make our algorithms fairer and just. How then do we confront this ceaseless desire to universalize on these unilateral terms? I suggest that these artists offer some clues. Instead of retreating, they sought to reimagine universalisms altogether, making it their own. As Mukti suggests in her work, what can we gain from such universalisms born elsewhere? Perhaps, like Ubuntu, these artists offer relational frameworks for other universalisms, ones staked on means rather than ends. Their search for significant form from the point of its furthest distance asks us to consider a different future for AI, a future in which AI is not driven by ends but means. Freed from its contemporary logic, perhaps it too can strive for significant forms in order to represent the world in all its promise and contradictions. My hope for a critical AI then is one that is allied to humans who know the dangers of a singular universalism and dream therefore of their multiplication. Perhaps alongside AI, we might create more spaces in the subjunctive, tethered to the now while dreaming of an otherwise. Recently, I've been struck.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lily Hu. I'm a PhD candidate in applied mathematics and philosophy at Harvard University. And today I'll be talking about predictive algorithms and illusory ideologies. So today I'm going to offer a critique of database predictive algorithms that'll focus on their status as epistemic tools. My critique is going to focus on the ideological character of these systems. That, even though they offer kind of incredible insight to how the world in which we live actually is and how it works, and even though they have kind of remarkable technical ability to capture these real, again, genuine truth about this world, the correlative and causal stories that algorithms tell will give us still only kind of partial views of the empirical world, and a systematically skewed one at that. And many of the claims that algorithms present, when taken to be whole truths, are actually going to be pernicious in content and perform in an ideological function. So there are kind of two roads diverge in the critique of database predictive algorithms. The first is a rather kind of straightforward ethical critique, which is that algorithmic decision-making tools perpetrate harms. They're discriminatory, they're tools of oppression, the litany of charges goes, and we ought to reject them on those grounds. The problem with this tack is that the interlocutors in this debate, they're so clearly diverge on normative standards, the debate kind of stops before it can really even start. This sort of disagreement really reaches its, almost parity level heights in the burgeoning algorithmic fairness field in the form of these mathematical proofs known colloquially as impossibility of fairness theorems. And that here there's kind of multiple statistical criteria of fairness that all seem reasonable, but are shown to be mutually unsatisfiable. So reasonable people can and do disagree about what makes an algorithm discriminatory or unfair. In the event of this kind of normative stalemate, the match typically goes to the incumbent, who after all is the one with the algorithm in hand. So this road towards critique has tended to terminate in a dead end where yes meets no. The other road towards critique looks to meet predictive algorithms on more of their home turf, challenging them on kind of empirical and epistemic grounds. This strategy looks to reroute critique in a way that will circumvent the seemingly intractable matters of substantive normative disagreement by challenging the supposed primacy of these systems and actually doing what it is that they advertise. The approach then seems able to kind of get more traction. It seems more promising as a route to making progress in the discourse. I think the inclination to go for this more internal epistemic critique is good. And in fact, I'm going to present my own version of a critique in this vein that I think will be more fruitful. But I don't think the standard ways of pursuing the line are actually very promising. The standard approach is to directly target the veracity of the empirics. So machine learning, these critics repeatedly remind us, find only correlations among X's and Y's. It can't distinguish genuine causal relations from mere spurious ones, let alone generate an understanding of what the relations mean. machine learning-based predictions, without human interpretation intervention, they often get things wrong. So algorithms shown to be the product of this kind of particular social and political position, the thought goes, will present a distorted ideological take on reality. So this kind of approach to critique thinks that the partiality of the algorithm will be evinced in these empirical characteristics of the system. So features of the data, outcomes issued, its peculiar set of inaccuracies and accuracy. And the idea is that if we show these suspect empirical shortcomings, and we can thereby expose its suspect political allegiances. So in this framing, the normative status and the status of algorithmic systems as kind of good epistemic tools will stand or fall together. Of course, this approach to the critical scrutiny of database algorithmic systems encounters an obvious stumbling block. So this possibility exposes a problem that's inherent in the premise of the approach, which is this imagined distance between, on the one hand, how the world really is, and on the other, what the ideological snapshot of the world taken by data and algorithms shows. So there's this presumed discrepancy between ideological seeing and true seeing. But this kind of mismatch is actually not the only conception of ideology that one could have. For example, in Marx's conception, ideologies need not be distortions or delusions. They need not be kind of trick mirrors fashioned to warp the perceptions of some of the true appearance of things. Some ideologies are illusory, they're a mirage. So they're really there, but they don't kind of show the true nature of the social system. So the lesson of illusory ideologies teaches that sparring on the empirics of the day doesn't ensure a successful unmasking of the ideology. For data and algorithms might very well be ideological and yet capture accurately empirical reality. So what's in fact ideological about the illusion that's set up is that there's actually nothing to examine behind the algorithm and its data. So a concrete example of the role that algorithms play in producing and sustaining illusory ideologies will be instructive. So consider an algorithm that's kind of set forth to predict failure to file one's health insurance claims on time. There are a number of features that one might look to collect data on in order to make such a prediction. So you might want to collect data on income, education level, race, employment status, the insurance company in question, the complexity of the claim process, and so on. So fed into the machine learning system, these data might well yield excellent correlations that may prove fruitful for prediction. And the correlations might even well suggest an accurate causal story about how individuals come to fail to file their insurance claims in a timely manner. We can suppose there's even nothing wrong with the causal story that's presented by the algorithm. The empirical causal explanation suggested, in fact, gives an accurate depiction of why individuals in the society fail to file their insurance claims on time. So, for example, the finding that low-income individuals who have unsteady work and a history of failing to consistently renew their insurance plans on time are especially prone to failing to file their claims on time. Let's suppose that's just true. So different normative judgments might now follow from what the empirical findings suggest as a matter of kind of achieving our practical goals. We can spar on normative grounds about what we ought to do given these empirical facts. But I want to suggest that there might be something to be gained by not jumping straight to the normative question. For key questions about causation and explanation yet remain. In fact, the sense of being kind of wrong-footed in critique when confronted with the verified empirical facts tracks precisely how illusory ideologies often work. So the empirical fact that being poor causes you to be less able to file insurance claims in a timely manner. So the empirical fact that being poor causes you to be kind of less healthy, they're true for the simple reason that they're made true by the undergirding social and economic order. The fact is so deeply entrenched in material reality that it appears as plainly true, bar none. But now here's where algorithms models presenting an accurate causal explanation enters to in fact contribute to the ideological illusion. After all, there's no deep connection of necessity between being poor and having worse health outcomes. But that fact is increasingly obfuscated as kind of further true details of the causal story of how it is that poor people come to have worse health outcomes are filled in. So the more correlations dredged up by the algorithm to complete the causal chain of events linking being poor to filing insurance claims late to having bad health, the more it looks like the empirical story has been told. And the further into the recesses sinks the truth, which is that having little income in a society is in fact no risk factor at all, at least in itself, in determining any kind of health outcome. It emerges as causally relevant only because of the particular structure and institutional designs of the system of social and health insurance that currently reigns in that society. So ideology critique can then illuminate a path towards an inquiry into the social world that on the one hand verifies the truth of some state of affairs, right? So for, to continue with the example that being poor causes one to have worse health outcomes. But it does so by showing exactly how it is that the proposition is made true by the operation of some larger social system. So for example, by the linking of income and health outcomes that's enforced by a for-profit system of care, one that exists in the absence of any meaningful safeguard of kind of socially provided resources. So it's this denaturalizing approach to critique that shows how one can stand in agreement with the validity of an algorithm's particular causal explanation without submitting to it as kind of all there is to say about the phenomenon at hand. So critique then takes the form of second order explanation, an explanation of dominant explanation. And the challenge is not to a particular kind of algorithm's outputs directly. Rather, the claim is that accuracy notwithstanding, the tool still can't yield the insights that drive it to true operation of the social system, which is the causation behind the causation. And as a result, it can't see what's misleading and not really true about its outputs. So ideology critique thus makes for an epistemic critique, but of a notably different kind from the approaches that focus on empirical validity. Instead, it charges that database algorithms, even when they give accurate causal explanations, present a systematically limited perspective in illuminating a whole host of causal factors, provide a deeper social explanation for the observed causal explanations. Now, of course, the fact that algorithms do not themselves paint the whole picture of the social explanation doesn't itself, pose any serious problems, for no single tool or theory, can provide a full explanation of really anything. However, the predictive prowess of algorithms, when powered by the set it and forget it magic of machine learning, has the effect of veiling this incompleteness. And it's this illusion-maintaining function of algorithms that makes them ideological instruments. Notice here that concern that the algorithms capture kind of the true causal model actually serve to bolster the point. But the primary technical aim here is that the model attain a successful explanation at the level of these first-order empirical causes. And then once those causal factors have had their say, as it were, there appears to be no need for further second-order explanation, another further explanation for why the causal story is what it is. While the possibility that there may exist reasons behind causal structure is obscured, the observed empirical causes take on then an appearance of naturalness, an appearance that suggests there's nothing more to see here. An algorithm's model, being statistical after all, puts forth what appears to be generic claims of how things just naturally are. Poor people are liable to fail to file their claims properly. Black people are just more criminal. Women wear skirts. The Upper East Side is an affluent neighborhood. Wages rise with increased educational attainment. The implication that such claims speak to how things naturally are or normally are is another instance of the ideological illusion. So insofar as these prediction-based algorithms draw on these statistical findings to make kind of decisions that then mirror these claims, illusory ideologies thereby shape the material world in their image. And so the illusion is further reinforced. And so it serves to self-sustain that, the algorithms were right after all. So therefore kind of seems to suggest that the algorithms offer this kind of complete empirical explanation. I want to argue that these two ideological effects of the algorithm, both the limiting naturalizing perspective on empirical reality that they offer and the pernicious ideological content of the claims they put forth, are actually quite connected. And the limited and insidious perspective of algorithms today emerges together out of the particular material conditions of algorithm design, construction, and deployment that happens to reign today. And the problem, to put it pithily, pithily concerns who owns the means of prediction. So there's first the plain fact that entry into the game of mass data extraction and deployment of data-based predictive systems requires, to begin with, significant capital in the form of access to data, significant infrastructure for computing power, the intellectual resources, the set of skills required to build these systems. And as it happens, the large corporations that do check all these boxes and make substantial use of these systems rarely look to transform the social systems within which they are embedded. In fact, it's precisely because of the pressures generated by these dominant social systems that are in part responsible for the complex correlations that make algorithmic prediction possible in the first place. So the forces that undergird, for example, the employer-based health insurance regime, that kind of carve out the grooves along which the need for and purchase of health insurance becomes patterned. Those factors make algorithmic prediction of, say, the likelihood of clicking on an Aetna ad or participating in a health insurance exchange makes those predictions an easier task. And so with the governing social system in place, the task of the algorithm then is to use data markers at the individual level. So markers about, an individual's race, their credit history, their employment status, to thereby index social positions within that system. And once those social positions are rendered legible, the algorithm can then go on to predict various outcomes that those in that social position are shuttled towards. So the focus on the individual as the primary data subject sets the conditions of possibility for the subsequent stages of model building and eventual prediction. After all, an algorithm can only produce correlations and causal claims out of the building blocks that it's given, not just in the kind of optimization tasks that it's set, but the kinds of data, in particular the kinds of features that are even collected and considered to be of potential use given the particular task in place. And here, what's significant is not so much the sample representativeness of the data that are collected, but the variables that structure the possibilities for how that prediction task is going to be executed. Since these variables are the raw materials from which correlative or causal regularities are generated, these factors constrain from the start the kinds of causal regularities that might even be candidates for subsequent decision-making. If you start with a different set of data, with a different set of features, we'll come to a different set of predictors for the same task. In other words, a different causal story for the outcome of interest. And so a predominant focus on individual level features to the exclusion of features that have the capacity to unmask the background structures that guide and constrain individual behavior makes algorithms liable to simply kind of parroting back the regularities of the social world, which again, while superficially true, hide the deep truths of the social system. So the critical diagnosis that I presented here scrutinizes algorithmic models as epistemic tools that perpetrates ideology. And I've argued that in focusing on kind of empirical accuracy only, and, even in the critical discourse that focuses on empirical accuracy, all of this serves to rather kind of sustain the illusory ideologies by naturalizing the social system that produces these empirical regularities that algorithms disclose, and thereby eliding other available explanatory questions, most notably why the discovered correlations are what they are, what other parts of the causal story might yet be missing. And when these statistical regularities are taken to be natural, algorithmic systems can seem capable of kind of oracle-like qualities, of being equipped to see into the true nature of things and of needing kind of no further elaboration. And so therefore, their deficiencies are rather obscured. Their deficiencies in terms of providing second order explanation and the partiality of the epistemic position that they occupy. And I've also argued that for matters owing to the kind of material processes of building complex database machine learning systems, the particular epistemic position that algorithms represent tends to track that of the dominant classes. And this also explains then why the statistical methods often parrot back claims that are ideological in content, generic claims that encourage essentializing readings of social groups. So poor people are just less timely with payments, as an example. So, and yet to say that ideology critique of algorithms lacks normative content entirely is not quite right either. So ideology critique is double-edged. It reveals an epistemic deficiency, but thereby is able to show a normative flaw in the system. So in providing an analysis of how it is that algorithmic models only present partial truths, and what's more, partial truths that are systematically limited in certain ways, ideology critique can call into question the normative status of algorithmic systems, and thereby open up scrutiny to the broader social conditions that undergird their power. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Safia Noble, and I am an associate professor at UCLA and the co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. And it's really my pleasure to get to participate in this event today. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've been tasked with thinking out loud a bit about some of the recent developments that I think have happened over the last decade that are certainly informing my work and informing the shifts that we see right now in academia, in industry, in policy, around kind of issues of fairness, equity, addressing racism, discrimination, sexism, many forms of harm that are tied to the kinds of technologies that we are engaging with on a regular basis now. And, you know, much of this stems from my own work. I wrote a book that came out in 2018 called Algorithms of Oppression, that was really looking at search engine technology, for example, as a case study on how we should reimagine technologies or even think about whether certain technologies should be in existence. And you know, I can think about 10 years ago when I first started that research, when I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I went to the iSchool there, the information school. And when I was trying to begin this journey of documenting the things that I saw that were specifically harmful to women and to women of color, this was very difficult to kind of apprehend and make legible to audiences besides kind of, you know, my crew of girlfriends from grad school and my advisor, and, you know, even finding dissertation committee members was quite difficult, because 10 years ago when we talked about the design and implementation of technologies, we really weren't thinking about computer code. We weren't thinking about the makers of these technologies, imbuing those technologies with their values, except in maybe kind of the Web 1.0 research, which, you know, of course, so profoundly influenced me. I think about people like Lisa Nakamura and Wendy Chun. I think about Anna Everett at UC Santa Barbara. You know, there were women of color who were writing specifically about how technologies could be designed in ways that were harmful to communities of color. And I really felt like I was, and still do feel like I'm in their tradition of picking up some of that work and looking more closely at the kind of broad scale social impact, but also the profit imperative that quite frankly drives some of these decisions. And in fact, renders vulnerable people even more vulnerable because they are not part of the profit imperative. They are the collateral damage on the way to making and printing, quite frankly, trillions of dollars. So it's important to me, I think, as I look out now, 10 years after that research started, and we have whole new fields of AI and ethics, for example, that have come into existence. And in many ways, some of the fundamental critiques about racism and sexism and kind of the political economy of race and racist systems is not really fundamentally, I think, being taken up. So, you know, I even have recently been surprised to see the National Science Foundation, for example, want to take up things like intersectionality as a design logic, and thinking about what kinds of products and projects NSF should be funding, what kind of research, more importantly, they should be funding, and using kind of an intersectional lens. But when you look more closely, sometimes you see that the computer scientists and engineers, people who work in machine learning and AI, who are thinking about, oh yeah, intersectionality, that's a great word, let's take that up, are often thinking about how to broaden technology design to include more identities, right? And of course, this is not precisely what intersectional theory is about. Intersectionality, when you look at the kind of the tradition of Black feminist scholarship and thinkers, and there are many stemming all the way back to, certainly pre-1960s, but, more importantly in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, this kind of Black feminist intersectional theorists were really talking about uneven power distribution in our society and the way in which certain identities are gendered and racialized to the bottom or to the most exploitive parts of our systems and our structures, our social structures, our economic and our political structures. And that is a very important frame that I want to just keep in the forefront of our conversations as we're talking about the future of technology design, because it's really simply insufficient to focus purely on kind of representation, just expanding the sphere, for example, of types of users that might be able to engage with the technology. But does that technology bolster broader systemic harm? And if it does, to what degree? So this is where I will give a case study, an example. The arguments and scholarly arguments around something like facial recognition software. Certainly we know from the very important work of Joy Bowamimi, Sunit Jabru, and others who are studying facial recognition software and the way in which it doesn't recognize Black faces or dark skin, that this is somehow technology that needs to be improved upon so that people are not falsely accused, so that facial recognition doesn't lock them out of their apartment or their housing complex, that facial recognition doesn't ensnare people, wrongly convict people, used as evidence, faulty evidence to change the course of someone's life if they're wrongfully accused, which of course we know is happening. We see this in the headlines. We could say that we need to improve these technologies. Certainly that this kind of idea of intersectionality at an identity-based level is important because it ensures that the technology is broadened to be more fairly capturing faces in particular. I think another way of looking at this is to say, does facial recognition bolster more sorting and more discrimination in our society? How is it used? Where is it used? Is it fairly deployed? Will it be used in more and more situations that will over-determine and predict people into futures that they may not want, or that may bolster and kind of uphold a highly stratified society and world? Will it be used to dislodge kind of our hyper-capitalist systems that keep people of color, Black people in particular, and Indigenous people kind of at the bottom of the class and caste systems? Or will it be used, in other ways that are more liberatory? Will it be used to enhance and maintain the carceral state? Or will it be, should it not exist because it can only be deployed in those ways in service of those things? These are the kinds of questions that I think are really before us. And this is one of the reasons why the critical theories like intersectionality, Black feminism, critical race theory are so important, because they get at these issues around systems and power and the distribution of power and resources in our society. And I think that this would be kind of where my thinking is right now about how do we recapture these conversations, because one of the things that is so concerning is to see the ways in which critical ideas and critiques of power, theories of power, studies about power are captured and reframed, defanged, depoliticized. and then kind of put back before us as the solution or as the intervention. And of course, these are the kinds of things we're thinking about at UCLA at our newly established Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, which I co-direct with Professor Sarah Roberts. Many of you who may know her work around commercial content moderation and the people who do this kind of work. Again, remembering that, where our work meets, hers and mine, is around this idea that artificial intelligence is really the labor of people, that many times, of course, people are thinking about artificial intelligence. And of course, this meeting today is really about kind of critical AI. And I've talked a bit about the critical, but I think it's important to also talk about the AI. What we know from our work is that the AI is also people, human beings who are adjudicating, whether that is all of our labor that gets used in the platforms where we are making decisions, where we are clicking on things, where we are reporting, where we are choosing, sorting. Those kinds of activities are part of the training of machine learning algorithms. And, we think of AI as being, I think many people who aren't computer scientists might think of AI. I certainly hear policymakers and others, journalists talk about it like it's magic. It is not magic. It is really about kind of a sets of instructions that are given to computers so that they can compute in particular ways. And all of our labor and our kind of human activity helps shape and train the kinds of AI that we are engaging with. So of course, AI is not without human intervention, a lot of human intervention, quite frankly. And I think these are other sites of power and exploitation. We see, for example, whether it's people who are doing content moderation in social media or people who are doing the work of labeling data sets and cleaning data, so to speak, and how that data is made and framed and used again to train algorithms is very important. So these are the spaces and places to me that are very important for us to be watching and making sense of and pushing back on. What I see, and that's been, I think, so disheartening in many ways, is the normalization of these kinds of harmful technologies coming into the marketplace, being deployed through a variety of different kinds of institutions, what feels like a huge grab of public resources and public goods by the tech sector. I'll give you an example of this. In the University of California system where I work, we are seeing, since COVID hit, all of our teaching moving to remote learning, which of course is happening at just about every school and university around the United States, or has been to some degree. And one of the things that we've seen is over time has been the shrinking budgets, the shrinking contribution of the state budget allocation to public universities in California. And as those resources have begun to diminish over the last 30 years, what we see is very tight budget situations, austerity measures that are being implemented. And those austerity measures have opened up new markets for technology companies to come in and provide solutions, right? Technology solutions. So one of the probably most egregious of these, in my opinion, was when the University of California stopped running its own email and IT backbone and brought in Google to run its IT backbone. And this is very serious, of course. The amount of software and licensing and hardware that's been purchased since COVID, just in the more immediate recent future, has been a huge new market opportunity for those kinds of companies. But we can pull back and we can ask ourselves not only the hard questions we need to ask, which is what portion of the budgets are going to academic instruction, which is faculty, graduate students, teaching assistants, clinical faculty, adjunct faculty, librarians, and other kinds of resource specialists that we really need to instruct and to do educational delivery in higher ed. We can ask what portion of the budget is available for human beings who do this work, and what portion has been allocated to technology, to software, and to hardware. These are questions I think we should be asking all over education right now. What has happened, in my estimation, is that in 30 years of the rise of Silicon Valley in California, and now, of course, Silicon Beach, which is right down the street from where I live here in Los Angeles, is that these companies in this sector, for the most part, doesn't pay taxes. So there's no revenue going into the public coffers that would otherwise fund democratic institutional counterweights to technology companies. So when we talk about things like, how is it that the public is so much more reliant upon something like a search engine rather than other forms of knowledge like books, libraries, other kinds of community technology centers, all kinds of places? Well, part of it is because there's no money in the public coffers to support those kinds of democratic institutions. So here we have an industry, quite frankly, and we feel this again so close to home in California, but I think this is really pervasive around the United States. We have an industry that has created the conditions by, and through tax evasion, offshoring profits, for example, and then it creates the conditions for its own market opportunity. When those institutions can no longer be funded by the public because there aren't enough funds, corporate taxation dollars in the coffers, then industries can come in and capture pieces of these institutions. And I think these are things that are really on my mind as we go forward into this kind of next decade, as we think about what COVID has done. We don't have the resources for the kind of public health, public media, again, these democratic institutional counterweights to big tech when we create every kind of municipal, state, and federal subsidy and loophole for this entire sector. So I think these are things that are on my mind as I am writing and thinking about where my work from the last 10 years of just kind of making visible that technology can harm, thinking more broadly about where we might intervene. How will we fashion some type of arrest of this, new normal, the normalization of these kinds of policies of privatization, policies of huge transfers of wealth from the public to private corporations. And I know that I'm not the only one thinking about this. I'm really so grateful to be part of this conversation with you all as we go forward in the rest of the day today. One thing I guess I'll just leave as a provocation, and this is something that I've really been trying to spend some time thinking about and researching and reading and studying more, is how do we create the paradigm shift? So many of us who are part of this conference have lived through different paradigms. When I'm with my students at UCLA and I explain to them how probably when I was born, the doctor had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, right? My mom probably smoked 2 packs of cigarettes right after she pushed me out, right from her hospital bed. Anybody from the 70s and the 80s knows what I'm talking about. It's a huge paradigm shift that we've gone through with big tobacco. Generations now really can't even imagine what it was like to live during the era of big tobacco when we were bombarded with advertising and marketing from tobacco companies about how, smoking makes you sexy, makes you pretty, makes you skinny, makes you a man, all the things. But we live in a different moment now where a handful of people, truly scientists, public health advocates and researchers, parents, all kinds of schools, all kinds of people really work together to shift the way we think about tobacco. And I think that we are due for a paradigm shift around big tech. And so my work kind of going forward is thinking about what would it take for us to not have the marketing materials and the tech funded research studies dominate the landscape. And of course, this is the place where there's so much important work for us to do. And I'm just grateful to be here and be in conversation with you about how we will do this work together. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. So we really are so lucky to have a chance to talk with you all here today. I thank you all for your great provocations. They have me personally very excited. They've been generative for me. Like my neck hurts over here from shaking my head so vigorously along with everything that you all are saying. I'm going to offer a sort of meta commentary to kick us off here, a set of questions while folks get their thoughts together and we get the Q&A function, fired up and running. So a really useful thread that I've seen through these presentations is this notion of socio-technical imaginaries that you all are sort of getting at in various ways that I think are really productive for discussion and that are really set up nicely at the end of Sophia's talk. As I listened to your presentations, I was reminded of a quote by Dr. Ruha Benjamin. She's a sociologist just up the road at Princeton. Her fabulous work, if you don't know it, you should check into it. But it's this quote in Race After Technology that, quote, most people live inside others' imaginaries. The nightmares of the oppressed are the flip side of an elite fantasy of a perfect world. And this is all sort of, I noticed that you all address historical and present dominant narratives or dominant perspectives of what is possible and what is preferable in social and technical practice, as well as how these dominant imaginaries become enacted in our social and technical life worlds in ways that enact, monopoly for some, extreme privilege for some, at the expense of the enactment of, misery for others. And that this happens very much along the lines of colonial, racial, gendered, and economic inequity. And I think importantly, all of you provide stances or provocations or sort of ways that we can think about how we might reshape these dominant imaginaries to reorient these socio-technical constellations, around AI or big tech, reorient them away from these inequities that are positioned as normal, natural, neutral, sort of inescapable truth, and towards something that looks more like justice for more people. So, there's a lot to talk about here, but I'd like to ask you all to say a bit more about ways forward beyond this dangerous socio-technical mess that we find ourselves in at present, and how your work shows us ways forward or examples by which we might, re-engineer consent or create, as Sophia said, these paradigm shifts around big tech and AI, around more sort of liberatory socio-technical projects. And I'm interested in, how your intellectual groundings help you think through ways to undermine the sort of neoliberal technocratic rationality that is, present in discourses and industries around AI that direct attention and resources, like Sophia was talking about, away from people, away from power and exploitation, and away from material, meaningful material solutions. So, I'd like each of you to talk about, what does dismantling harmful tech look like from your perspective? Obviously, I know there's no magic bullet and this is a huge question, but I'd like to get you, your perspectives on where we might start or, where we might look. I open it to any of you. I might ask Lily to talk first about where, you know, the great work that you do, or the great work that you presented, provides a really conceptual, useful conceptual stance or tool that seems like it would be really convincing to be deployed to dismantle, you know, dominant cultures, uncritical adherence to, you know, the harmful ideological reproduction that happens through, you know, all of the sort of machinations of AI, the development, the deployment, and use. It seems particularly convincing, and I'm wondering if you could talk about where and to what audiences you envision your work to be most productively taken up beyond, you know, your field.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Can you all hear me okay? So I think of ideology critique as, on the one hand, having this sort of epistemic quality, clarifying what it is that we're looking at here. And I'm pointing out that algorithmic systems are a part of an overall ideological system that re-entrenches and also delivers new ideological content with a lot of, I think, very pernicious ideological content. So there's kind of this epistemic clarification about what exactly these tools are doing that I think can make for a new entry into a political project. That is a kind of, when we're able to see more clear-eyed about what's going on here, we have a kind of goal political transformation, and combining the analysis with the critique allows us to do philosophy as some sort of activism, which is what Marx wanted all of us to do. And I think that when we see that there's a kind of systematic like lens through which AI or algorithmic tools are able to give us information, and even if it's true, right? Like, I'm setting aside, like, you know, predictions are really accurate and there's like a real causal story that's being unearthed here by this great system that has, you know, giving us really interesting statistical insight into our social world. We should be asking the second order question, well, why is the world the way that this algorithm is revealing it as? And I think what's really dangerous about algorithmic systems is the possibility of closing off that second question about structure just by showing these like empirical correlations, saying, okay, the story's been told. That's kind of the ideological function, to kind of close the conversation and say like, oh, well, you know, we just found that this group of people are more likely to commit crimes. And it's true, it's borne out in the data, and it's predictively accurate, and here's the story, and blah, blah, blah. And the ideological function is to close off the second question, which is the question about, you know, the agency that's behind the structure. Why is the structure the way it is? These are like what I'm calling second order explanations, and allow for us to actually kind of challenge the political context that the ideologies undergird. So I suppose I think that ideology critique is a kind of way outside of a pure stalemate of normativity, even though I'm always down to play the straight normative game. I do think that there's a lot of potential room for us to kind of use what we learned from algorithms to inquire more deeply into the social systems that produce these kinds of contradictions and these generic claims that have been taken to be true. And there's an opportunity for us to use these tools, like I was saying, this like cute phrase, like the means of prediction, to actually transform the means of prediction and harness them for a greater social understanding at the structural level. And I think that should be kind of the site of political contest, rather than, oh, like these sort of superficial questions about whether the tool was accurate or not. Like, whatever, set aside questions about accuracy. Doesn't matter, because whatever is accurate is deeply unjust regardless of whether it's true or not. And the question is, what is the actual, like, what is animating? What are the dynamics that are animating these kinds of correlations, true or not?
Great, yeah, 100%. That's wonderful. I love that. Dwight, I'd like to hear a bit more about how the anti-colonial and relational frameworks driven by means but not ends manifests beyond you know, the Indian modernist artists that you talked about today, maybe in how they manifest in liberatory counter design projects that you mentioned toward the end of your presentation.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. So to answer how these are, how these to me seem emancipatory, what their politically emancipatory contents might be, I think what they promise is really a politics of refusal rather than recuperation or a slight nudge towards fairness. That's what's kind of the radical content of something that otherwise looks to be an anti-politics almost, or that's been the critique of these kinds of aesthetizations of AI. I think the political content of that is to say or ask the question of what does it look like if we orient AI away from pragmatic ends, to stop just pushing ahead and ahead every time we find that AI does not produce a more just world, and then pause and actually reframe the basis of that question and think otherwise with AI as an aesthetic practice which doesn't promise an ends, but is just a process and a means. And I think I won't take much more time, but the ends and means question was so essential to the process of decolonization. I think we're losing sight of that for that in so many contexts. The idea wasn't that the colonial structure in itself was what was at stake and what needed to be overthrown, but what was at stake was how we did it and to what end. And the way that anti-colonial projects have now mutated into fascist nightmares, I think that gives us pause into thinking about the means through which we contest AI, not to just work within. We need to do the work within, but we also need to do the work of expanding what's possible to think outside the frames already given to us, like Lily says.
Got to turn on mute. You'd think after a year of doing this, I'd remember. Thank you for that, Dwight. That was wonderful. So Safia, I wonder if you could speak with us a little bit about, the work that you're doing and that you're engaged in, sort of reimagining, a different future, these types of, sort of regrounding ourselves in different, maybe, critical and epistemic practices, like intersectional Black feminist technology studies that you wrote about in 2016, and how these, sort of frameworks or conceptual frameworks inform your thinking around, not only the AI industrial complex and the pseudocritical hype, but, sort of where it points us to in the future, and maybe some examples that you have encountered that seem hopeful or productive in this arena of sort of reimagining, what our socio-technical future might look like.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I want to say that I am so honored to get to be a part of this conversation. I mean, Lily and Dwight, your work just blows me away, and I love it so much. And I just imagine what it would be like to, be younger and to have gotten to get, learn from you when I was younger in doing this work. And so I feel like the part of what we're witnessing even in this session today is the expansion of the, conversation and the set of possibilities and the types of interventions, the critiques and the, imaginary about ways forward is so much richer to me today than it was before. And I just want to acknowledge that and say that this is incredibly important, the work that you two are doing, and Britt, your work too, for sure. I think that I don't know. I think about the dynamic state of our humanity. And one of the things that's been challenging about the conversations about AI and predictive technology, of course, when you know how those work, that, let's say, a snapshot in time, a moment of data capture becomes the whole story about the future, right? And it's probably part of my own lived experience that is dynamic and shifting and becoming, different as, life continues. That reminds me of how important it is that we have this possibility for transformation, for redemption, for possibility. And what AI to me forecloses is all of that, because it tries to stabilize the past and recreate the past into the future. And this is so dangerous. And I think about the work right now outside of the internet or outside of digital technologies. Kind of what's in my mind when you ask a question like that is I think about somebody, I think about grassroots organizers, community organizers who are doing the work of enfranchising people who are poor, who are Black, who are women, who are children, who are, quite frankly, living a day-to-day existence that's far from these conversations. And that is actually where a real site of power and transformation and resistance to this kind of increasing global wealth and economic and social inequality is happening, right? So I feel like in our space, our job is to think about how we can disrupt and stop and abolish the kinds of systems that make that work harder, the work of enfranchising people, right? Of redistributing wealth. I mean, I think about every year we have more and more data and technology. I say this all the time, and we have more global social inequality to go with it. Every year, the world becomes more and more unequal. And so these systems for me are a constant in shaping that and in fact, accelerating that. And so, I think that our work belongs where people who are captured and whose lives are categorized and organized out of the possibilities for a high quality of life. I mean, this is our work. This is my work. And it's motivated, of course, by, my family members and my community and people that, might not participate in like this direct work, but whose lives are hanging in the balance, who can and can't get what is needed. So I guess, it's it's really quite simple to me. It doesn't even seem complicated. Why is it impossible to live in a major city? Because it's so unaffordable. Why is food so expensive? Why can't we have healthcare? I mean, these things are so basic. They're like basic, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs kinds of questions. And yet we see a constant, and I love, Lily, your point. It's like this ideological investment that somehow the AI is going to feed us and house us and clothe us and love us. It is not. It is not. And I feel like, Dwight's work about the art, that the artists give us a different kind of imaginary, right? In response to the rise of these kind of authoritarian ideologies about how the world should be. And if we don't think that Silicon corridors and the technocracy has these same kinds of fascist leanings, then we're not looking very closely. So I don't know. That's what's motivating me, and that's what I'm looking at. That's who I'm looking at. I'm looking at people who are building the networks to resist these things. Yeah,
100%. So a question from Katina Michael that is very much on this topic. I feel like I can intuit what you might say about this, Safiya, but she asks, what do you propose we do in response to companies like Clearview AI, who are harvesting and scraping the web for images and using them in their alleged 99.9% accurate identification of criminal suspects? Speaking of fascistic technology.
I mean, some of these technologies should be illegal. They should not be allowed to come into existence. It's stunning to me that we talk about, Lily, ideologies. I mean, how the tech sector broadly has carved out a space ideologically about its alleged neutrality and lack of harm, such that you can deploy these kinds of technologies with zero oversight, no public oversight. And really it's our job as public employees, as state employees, as artists, as students, as researchers, to do the labor of proving the harm rather than the companies themselves proving no harm prior to release. So that doesn't make sense. And I think, there's no reason. There's plenty of technologies, there's plenty of products. Look to pharmaceutical, look to other kinds of industries. When there is harm, those products have to come off the market. I mean, you can use just the most basic consumer safety laws under the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. But of course, these are also about our philosophies about what these technologies do and for whom.
Great, or not great, completely upsetting, right? A mess, but wonderful answers. And I appreciate your thoughts on this. We all do. So I'm moving on to the next question by Rachel Saunders, who wanted to ask she wanted to ask what bridges the panel thinks could build to produce an AI narrative of hospitality that accounts for non-European and non-American voices. Maybe directed to Dwight, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I'm sorry about my video. So in the age of Zoom, this is always happening to me. This idea of hospitality is so fascinating to me in terms of thinking about AI, because we know how to, we have some tools to think about it in terms of the migration and movement of people, and the dangers of something like unconditional hospitality, in the sense that we erase difference by extending the idea that hospitality is in a completely unmarked category. So what I mean by that is, I think AI promises a dangerous singular universalism through which hospitality can be imagined, of all humans having a sort of unmediated access to a new world of commensurability. But what I think, thinking about the decolonial challenges us constantly, is to ask about the differential categorizations of what being human means, and what extending hospitality on those grounds to those on the grounds of humanness limits. So to put it much more plainly, I think that AI promises this allure of anyone's entry, of the possibility that anyone can become part of the calculation for all good and not so good ends. But that has never been the experience of any kind of singular universalism. It's always been an exclusionary act. So I think some of the older tools we have in thinking about hospitality as a concept really extends into thinking about this new iteration of a dangerous universalism we are confronted with.
B. Bogart asks Lily, in terms of generic claims, what about the role of means versus outliers and variance in forms of degree to which classifications? It just left my it just left my feed. Sorry. Lauren or Jake, could you recover that question for me?
Sorry, that was my fault. The rest of the question is as follows. In terms of generic claims, what about the role of means versus outliers and variance in terms of the degree to which a classification is quote unquote true? Focus on means seems to be destined to uphold marginalization. Apologies, I popped it into the answered column prematurely.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think we have to again consider the kinds of statistical generic claims that algorithms and even non-algorithmic systems make as functioning first and foremost ideologically, rather than just kind of statements of empirical reality. So if I say something like mosquitoes carry West Nile virus, that's a kind of true claim, even though the majority of mosquitoes don't carry West Nile virus. Or if I say, birds lay eggs, that's a true claim, even if most birds don't, or half of birds don't lay eggs. And there's a question, I think, about why we take certain generic claims to be true, even when they're not like broadly true as a kind of statistical matter. And the reason, I think, is because we have these, well, there's all sorts of work on this, but there's kinds of, the function of the claim is to kind of take particular instances of a category and show them to be marks of like what the category really is. So like the claim that mosquitoes carry West Nile are supposed to kind of draw out like the danger in mosquitoes, right? Like mosquitoes as a class of, as a group of species of insects have this like, scary quality. They carry their disease vector or something. And so when we kind of get these corresponding claims that algorithms make about, let's say, Black people are more criminal, right? Like we have to think first and foremost, what is the ideological function of a claim like that? Setting aside questions about the kind of the extent to which the claim is statistically true. The kind of assessment should always be on the grounds of like, what is the function of a claim like this? What is the kind of essentializing, what's the essentializing kind of implication that undergirds the claim, and kind of start from there as our assessment of, how we should be dealing with these sorts of systems. They're just always, that's kind of the way I always think about it. Like, what is the function of this sort of claim? What is it trying to get me to understand about the world? And how is it essentializing a particular group in a way that furthers other kinds of pernicious ideologies?
Great answer. So here's a question from David Squires. I was fascinated by the methodological thread running through each of these talks. Critical perspectives on AI seem to run up against a double methodological problem. First, humanists may not have the technical knowledge to parse complex algorithmic systems. And second, many of these algorithmic systems we want to study are proprietary and not accessible. And so he asked if he wondered if the panelists might say more about how they've navigated these methodological obstacles, or if they see them as obstacles at all, right? There are assumptions here that you may not have encountered in your actual practice. So
I'm happy to take this one quickly, because this was a really big issue when I was working on the dissertation to book. I consulted with many computer scientists, social scientists, humanists, as I was thinking about the methods for my own research. And there was a logic that was prevailing that only technical people could actually understand or critique the technology, right? And that there are still people who would argue that if you can't see the proprietary software, that you're out of turn to speak to it. Now, I find this interesting because even some of the technologists and computer scientists and machine learning engineers don't understand the technical systems that they're working on. And of course, when you read the interviews, for example, of some of the people, for example, who work on search at Google, I mean, you're not talking about a discrete piece of code. You're talking about a very, very, very complex set of algorithms that have been worked on by different people for a very long time. Even when they're trying to intervene on their own product, sometimes they can't fix the logics. They just have to down rank troublesome results. So I think that these are, the assumption that even the technical people somehow can fix it or do better is a false one, in their own words. Now, secondly, I think that when we talk about applied mathematical systems, all right, the assumption is always that they're somehow pure in a pure state of mathematicalness, and that the humanists and the social scientists don't understand that. And so there's like, they have a more limited point of view. But see, none of these systems exist outside of a social space. None of them exist outside of some form of human engagement or social engagement. And, you know, I feel very confident in saying that most engineering programs do not teach about the social dimensions of technology deployment. So you have people who are, in fact, profoundly underqualified around the social and human dimensions of intervention. And of course, this is like saying that only the biologist knows about what it means to be human because they study the cells of the body. But see, that's an incomplete picture of humanity and what it means to be human. It is a dimension. And I would argue that the engineering dimension of technology is analogous, that it is insufficient. It's an incomplete picture because it gets deployed in incredibly complex ways socially. So this is part of the reason why the humanists and the social scientists, I think, are so important. And one of the other questions, you know, here is about, you know, why foreground that the women and the people of color and the LGBTQ people who've done the research, right? And I will stand by this, that these are the people who have made a lot of these conversations legible, that we can even get in on it. That's important because they have different vantage points. We have different vantage points, different lived experiences, different cultural and gendered and sexuality contexts that actually have afforded us the ability to ask different questions that heretofore had not been asked. They had not been asked because of the point of view. This is one of the reasons why having many points of view and many people from many walks of life engaged in these conversations is absolutely crucial, because you see different things. There were certainly many people writing about Google, but they were not asking questions about Google's specific harm to people of color, to women of color. And you know who asked those questions were people of color and women of color. So that link is important. You know, this idea that there's some universal human that can fully understand conceptually the landscape, that is also part of the critique, because white men, for the most part, and Asian men in Silicon Valley have stood in as the proxy for all humans. And of course, we can look at the data and see that that is an insufficient and a very narrow lens. And this is one of the reasons why I think we also, not only do we foreground why it's important to have humanists and social scientists, it's also important to have women and people of color, working class people, people from all over the world, engaged in these conversations. Yes, it is activist, but it is also produces better research, full stop.
Great, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and I would just kind of say, if any of this now seems rather obvious or something in retrospect, it's only because there have been so many incredible scholars who have been exactly people who have taken marginalized perspectives and actually managed to somehow pierce through and over the past several years and mainstream them, that now we can take for granted that standpoint epistemology is true. Like, the only reason we can do that is because of the incredible, you know, legwork of so many people who have otherwise been, you know, silenced, or not even silenced actively, or, you know, or just kind of deliberately neglected. That it's now obvious, and but we shouldn't take that for granted, right? Like, that's only because of extremely hard work that's been consistent and also consistently, you know, rejected still by mainstream scholarship and voices. So I don't know, I always feel like I need to say that it's like, yes, it's only because people have been working at it so consistently against extremely, you know, still continue like a lot of opposition. And yeah.
Thank you both, Lily and Safio, for that, I think, what very wonderful meditation on, you know, what exactly it is that we're doing whenever we're studying AI critically, and like what critical AI means, and, you know, sort of help us focus and, you know, make sure that we're oriented on, these very important issues that I think, are very much at the forefront of, critical AI and the types of things that we're working through here. I have a question from Samantha Kwan, which is, what are some solutions to society's shift to digital currency like Venmo and Apple Pay, when we're considering that these technologies exclude people such as the unhoused? Dwight, I think you're muted.
I imagine Lily would be able to answer this better than I could. But I'm happy to join in very quickly in a more conceptual way, because I don't know much about financial technologies, but in the sense of how we think of the excluded in relation to the universal when it comes to thinking about AI. And what I mean by that is this, again, to return to this question of hospitality, AI is fundamentally strange. And like Sophia said just now, the people designing it aren't necessarily experts on what the products of their designs are. So when when this part of it is so opaque, I think there's a danger in jumping from thinking that we understand this new form and then to instantiating it to all sorts of social projects, including financial inclusion. So rather than inclusion, I think we still have to wait a minute to kind of figure out what the logics of universalism within AI are that might be essentially exclusionary to begin with. So the jump from understanding the strangeness of AI to believing that we comprehend it, I think runs so many risks. And I think that requires pause before jumping to any thought about inclusion, of redemption, or even of some sort of social mitigation.
Yeah, I would say, and for instance, in Massachusetts, I know it's illegal for businesses not to accept cash. And that kind of legally, that goes back to a lot of civil rights statutes when businesses were deliberately not accepting cash for discriminatory reasons, because disproportionately, guess who didn't have access to bank accounts? Guess who didn't have access to traditional credit lines, credit cards, other forms of legal tender, as it were. And again, we have to keep in the kind of the front of our minds, these questions about background access to what we see as just standard goods, the goods that everybody has. And this is where, again, the perspective of individuals that have different, let's say, social backgrounds or access to the social world is absolutely critical. And it doesn't even, you don't need to be some sort of even like a radical thinker to get to the conclusion that people with more experience with poverty, people with more experience of exclusion from traditional banking institutions are going to be all else equal, more equipped with understanding when they're going to be barred from significant access to social goods and resources, goods and services. And this is where I think a lot of people who just kind of assume everybody has a bank account, just like are missing key kind of empirical information about how vast swaths of the US kind of go about their day-to-day lives. Like being unbanked, not having credit cards, this is not a very, I know people are probably surprised in Silicon Valley to find out that there are tens of millions of people who do not have access to banking institutions. This is not a marginal phenomenon. I think it's something, I don't have the statistics right on hand here, but millions of people have just no credit score at all, not even like a low credit score. They're just not even in the kind of ecosystem of credit. And this is again where it's kind of standard, as they might say, blind spots because of lack of the social positioning that would put you in a place where you would be able to see that this is an obvious issue of justice. That affects not just the people who are unhoused, all sorts of people, undocumented peoples, are people who are in the US who just don't feel comfortable being in institutions like traditional institutions of banking.
I think bridging off of that, unless Sophia, you wanted to say anything about it. Michelle Gilman says that, you know, given the insights of the speakers here today and the fact that you all have such powerful, you know, stances and like, you know, are coming from a very sort of well-researched and, you know, articulate like place of, you know, understanding the situation. Why are these like, why are the things that we're talking about here today not persisting or dominating public discourse and policy making? Why do techno-utopian views persist to dominate public discourse and policy making? And, you know, it's very frustrating. I know it's frustrating to all of us, right? But I wondered if all of you could say a little bit about that.
Well, I'll say that I'm really looking forward to the day when Lily and Dwight have the platform that Mark Zuckerberg has, or that, you know, all of the, you know, great men of Silicon Valley have, who've really set the agenda. And of course, in a country, in the US, that really venerates this great man ideology. You know, so, you know, power and lack of power are the real reasons why the best ideas don't rise to the top. I mean, we live in a false consciousness about a meritocracy, that somehow that the best ideas and the best thinkers rise to the top, when we know that, I mean, even in academia, there's such pervasive racist and sexist discrimination, lots of reasons why good ideas get suppressed, don't get supported, and powerful people are able to set the agenda, set the discourse, buy multi-million-dollar advertisements that they can run on television with, you know, with Beyonce. And, you know, I mean, this is one of the reasons why when we talk about, you know, capital, I mean, this is just classic capitalism in the sense that it sets the agenda and controls the discourse and makes it very difficult. Having said that, I think that it is incredible. And I know for people who are new to these conversations, that every week now, there are conferences and meetings like this of brilliant people who are thinking critically about how to speak truth to power, how to abolish, how to reimagine. And that is something, again, I mean, it was very hard to find a conference to go to like that when I was a graduate student a decade ago. And even then, we couldn't have these kinds of conversations with this level of kind of nuance and depth and interrogation. I think, I mean, the people who came and did that were definitely outliers. So, you know, I guess it's important to remember that it's, you know, progress in some ways is being made. Many, many, many more people, thousands more people are in this conversation now of critique. In fact, we know that that work has been effective because IBM and Google and Microsoft somehow are declaring themselves, you know, the innovators around ethics. I mean, nothing could be more hilarious than that. But, you know, that's their response to the critique and to the powerful organizing and activism that's happened in response to their dangerous products. So, you know, I guess I feel heartened, and I want to acknowledge that that is very important, that we have a sense of that we can really know. And of course, anybody who can put, you know, Dwight and Lily's work up to global audiences, please do. You know, I mean, this is why our networks, and also, you know, how do we elevate these thinkers? How do we use these systems to award them and support them and make them more visible? I mean, this is also part of how we create new normals and mainstream really important critiques.
Yeah, I would just add, like, there are strong material interests that are driving the continued narratives of techno optimism, like very strong material interest in getting your returns, getting in and then getting out as quickly as possible before, the overhype catches up. I mean, we saw this with the self-driving cars situation. We're seeing it we're seeing it potentially in ad bubbles. There is a lot of reason to continue to peddle this kind of optimism just because it makes money and just because that capital is looking for investment all the time. And tech is very sexy. And why not believe that every problem can be resolved with cool AI? Sounds pretty, would be nice if that were true. And I would make money if it were true. So, why not? I'm continually, again, so consistently surprised to the extent where I shouldn't be surprised anymore that continues to be the dominant narrative. And in spaces like this, we're super lucky in the past several years to have built a community where we can detect the BS, as it were, quite easily. But unfortunately, that's still in pockets of critical scholarship, whereas the water more generally in the broad landscape, you go and you drive down the 10 and you see the high billboards about still AI is going to detect your next heart attack or something. And why does it continue to be that case? Because Samsung needs to sell their new watch and other people need to find places for them to get higher returns. So we continue to yell out of our particular smaller but growing communities, and hopefully we're going to make greater waves. But it's still really important to recognize that the dominant voices are still peddling this narrative. Like, there's none of this is redundant at all. None of this is kind of at this point like common sense. It's still not. And that's why I think it's even more important that y'all are doing this kind of initiative, and everybody work needs to just continue to be beamed out there.
If I can jump in for a second, yeah, we need these conversations amplified, but I'm just struck by the incredible obduracy of this idea of technological utopianism, because it feels to me like we're in the third version of it. First, there was the colonial idea that the native could be technologically uplifted. Then came the post-colonial version, which was that we could fix the ills of colonialism through technology. And now we have number 3, which is this new global version of the same discourse. And I think the simple answer for me is that it just is a convenient way to distract from both the harder and easier questions of social justice, which is why did techno-utopianism gain the currency it did in the post-colonial period? Because nobody was actually willing to enact land reforms, and nobody was actually willing to enact truly revolutionary shifts from the colonial to the post-colonial. And hence we have techno-utopias. But at the same time, I like utopic thinking, and I like the possibility of a utopia that we can reach towards. And I think that has to be premised then on different grounds towards an orientation that perhaps takes this kind of unconditional hospitality as its horizon, that we do not do this as a means of uplift, but we do this based on the premise that the other is strange, and that the strangeness is part of utopic thinking, that it isn't an answer, but a way of broadening our imaginations.
Thanks so much. I think that this is really a great question, or a sort of great meditation from all of you to end this on. This has been very generative for me, and I'm sure it has been for everybody else in our audience. I'd love to talk with you, each of you for an entire day about all of these ideas that, we've been discussing here. And, thank you, obviously, so much to our panelists for sharing time with us here today to get at these difficult questions that, with this critical AI initiative at Rutgers, we're trying to meaningfully and materially address from a number of different sort of interdisciplinary perspectives. I think, what Dwight was saying about orienting our work on different grounds so that it works in different ways. Orienting our work in socio-technical systems on different grounds so it works in different ways than it does at present, is absolutely crucial and fundamental towards, this question again of imaginaries and how we might imagine, a better future and imagine steps and tactics and strategies to get there. I think, all of you have talked today about these important things, and I'm frankly very excited to continue these conversations with you. Because, to me and to most of you, I'm sure this is such an important part of the work that we're doing. We're sort of, building community, building out our networks, building out research that attends to, our communities, centers the needs of those who are currently immiserated by these socio-technical systems. And, this manifests in, building power and building political work in the end. So on that note, I hand it over to Lauren for final remarks, but I want to thank you all so much for coming today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Britt. My final remarks are all about thanking panelists, thanking audiences for great questions, thanking moderator, thank tech support staff, and audience, please do join us for our next event on March 26th. We are adjourning for spring break here at Rutgers. And do remember that if you would like to look at a link for a recording of this panel or any of the previous, just write to us. We will be building an archive. We're working on that. Same for information about joining us for the breakouts, just write. And please join the audience in doing whatever it is that you do when you're on a Zoom to thank people for a great presentation.